James Carver had seen a lot in his time as a soldier. He had fought battles on strange planets, met alien species, and witnessed the most dangerous of situations. But nothing could have prepared him for what was happening today. He stood in front of the Exarchan Queen's palace, feeling like a man out of place. The air was thick with the scent of alien flowers, and towering statues of Exarchan warriors lined the entrance. As he walked into the grand hall, his boots echoed against the polished floor. The palace was beautiful, unlike anything he had seen on Earth. James was summoned here on a diplomatic mission, tasked with negotiating a peace treaty between humans and the Exarchan. He had been briefed on their history, their culture, and their ways. But today, things took a strange turn. When he entered the throne room, he saw her, Queen Seralath of the Exarchan. She stood tall and regal, wearing armor that shimmered like the stars in the sky. Her eyes, bright like emeralds, locked onto his, and James could feel a chill run down his spine. "Welcome, human soldier," she said, her voice strong yet calm. "I trust your journey here was uneventful." James nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Majesty." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile he was used to. It was almost knowing, as if she had already made up her mind about something, and now it was time to share it with him. "I have a proposal for you," she continued, "one that will change the fate of your world." James furrowed his brow. "A proposal? I thought we were here to negotiate peace." "You are," Seralath replied. "But peace comes with bonds. Bonds that must be made, not just in words, but in action." James was confused. He had seen many things in his time as a soldier, but he had never heard of a peace deal that involved personal bonds. "Explain yourself, Your Majesty," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Seralath took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "I have chosen you, James Carver, to be my husband." The words hit James like a slap. His eyes widened, and he took a step back. This was not what he had expected. He was a soldier, not a prince. He had never been prepared for something like this. "What?" he stammered, unable to hide his shock. "You have been chosen," Seralath repeated, "not just because you are a soldier, but because you are a symbol of your people's strength and resilience. Together, we will unite our worlds. Together, we will create an unbreakable bond." James stood there, frozen. He had never been more confused in his life. A wedding? To an alien queen? It didn't make sense. But Seralath's eyes were clear and serious, and he knew she wasn't joking. I need time to think," James said, his mind racing. This is too much." Seralath nodded slowly, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But know this, soldier, this is the fate of both your people and mine." James turned and walked out of the palace, the weight of her words pressing down on him. As he looked up at the alien sky, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. James Carver sat in his quarters, his mind racing. His thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Why him? Why had Queen Seralath chosen him of all people? He was just a soldier, nothing special, just another face in the crowd of humanity. And yet, here he was, being asked to marry an alien queen. It didn't make sense. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as he stared out the window, looking at the alien city below. The sky was different here, darker, but filled with strange, glowing stars. It was beautiful, yet it felt so far from anything he knew. The sound of a soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. He turned around, startled. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. The door opened, and a Exarchan guard stepped inside. "The Queen requests your presence," the guard said in a deep, resonant voice. James stood up, his heart racing. "Now?" The guard nodded. "Yes, now." With a deep breath, James followed the guard through the palace corridors. His feet echoed against the cold stone floor, each step taking him closer to a decision that could change everything. When they arrived at the Queen's chambers, James hesitated before entering. He still wasn't sure what to expect. Was he being tricked? Was this some kind of test? But there was no turning back now. Inside the chamber, Queen Seralath stood by a large ornate window. Her long silver hair cascaded down her back, and her golden armor gleamed in the dim light. She turned as James entered, her expression calm but intense. There was no smile on her face this time, only a look of determination. "Sit," she said, her voice soft but commanding. James sat in the chair across from her, unsure of what to say. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands felt clammy. This was the moment when everything would change, but he still didn't fully understand why it had to be him. Seralath studied him for a moment, her eyes piercing and thoughtful. Then she spoke. "James Carver, you are a human soldier, yes?" she asked. James nodded, still unable to speak. Her gaze seemed to see straight through him, into his very soul. "You must be wondering why I chose you," she continued. "I have been watching your species for many years. I have studied your strength, your determination, your will to survive. These are qualities I admire, but there is more." James felt a flicker of curiosity. "More?" he asked. Seralath walked over to him, her movements graceful and measured. "Yes, our people, the Exarchan, have long been burdened by a curse. We have no way to lift it. Until now, our fate lies in the union of our species, a bond that can only be forged through love and understanding." James blinked in surprise. "A curse?" She nodded. "A curse that has plagued our bloodline for generations. We cannot escape it on our own. Only through this marriage, through the strength of our combined will, can we hope to break free." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy cloud. James realized that this was not just about him and her. It was about the survival of her people. And in some strange way, it felt like his own fate was tied to theirs. "What are you asking me to do?" he whispered. Seralath's eyes softened. "I am asking you to be my partner, not just in marriage, but in everything that comes after. This decision will bind our worlds together." James took a deep breath. The pressure was immense, but he also felt something else, something he couldn't explain. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a part of something bigger. "Give me time," he said, looking into her eyes. "I need to think about it." Seralath nodded, understanding. "You will have your time. But remember, James, the choice is not just yours. It is the fate of both our peoples." James Carver paced back and forth in his quarters, his mind in turmoil. The Queen's words echoed in his head. It is the fate of both our peoples. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The weight of that statement was like a heavy burden on his shoulders. He had been sent to this distant planet as a soldier, trained for combat, not for diplomatic missions, or worse yet, an alien marriage. But here he was, stuck in the middle of it, with no easy way out. He stopped pacing and glanced out the window. The alien city below was full of strange sights. The streets were alive with Exarchan creatures walking about, all busy with their own tasks. It was a beautiful place in its own way, but it felt so foreign to him. Nothing about this made sense. A wedding? To an alien queen? It seemed impossible. James had been briefed on the Exarchan's history and their culture. They were a proud species, known for their strength and their advanced technology. But what James hadn't known until now was their curse, a curse that had bound them for generations. Seralath had spoken of it in their meeting, but the more he thought about it, the less he understood. Could his marriage to her really lift this curse? Was he the key to saving an entire civilization? He sat down on the edge of his bed, his thoughts spinning. His duty as a soldier was clear: to follow orders, to protect his people, and to ensure peace. But was this what peace looked like? Was this his duty now? Or was he being swept up in something much larger than he could understand? Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He didn't have to be told who it was. "Come in," James called out, standing up. The door opened, and one of the Exarchan guards stepped inside. "The Queen requests your presence again," the guard said, his deep voice steady. James sighed. "Of course she does." The guard didn't respond, just waited for James to follow. He had no choice. If he wanted to understand what this marriage really meant, he would have to speak to Seriloth again. As they made their way through the palace, James couldn't help but feel the weight of every step he took. It felt as though his entire future was being decided with each footfall. The Exarchan Queen wasn't just a leader. She was the key to the survival of her people. And somehow, he was tied into all of this, whether he liked it or not. They reached the Queen's chamber, and the guard stepped aside, allowing James to enter. Seriloth stood at the far side of the room, her back to him as she gazed out at the alien landscape. The soft glow of the setting twin suns lit up the room in a warm golden hue. "James Carver," Seriloth said, her voice calm but firm. "You have had time to think. Have you made your decision?" James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no more answers than before, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep running from this. He had to face it, head on. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice heavy with doubt. "But I know one thing, Your Majesty. If I said yes, it's not just my life that changes. It's both of our worlds." Seriloth turned to face him, her eyes filled with understanding. "That is the truth of it. And that is why I chose you. You are stronger than you know, James. You carry the hopes of not just your people, but mine as well." James looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of something. A connection. It wasn't love, not yet, but something was beginning to stir within him. And in that moment, he realized that his choice was far from simple. It wasn't just about him anymore. James Carver stood at the edge of the Exarchan Palace grounds, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had yet to make. His mind still raced, thinking of the offer Seriloth had given him. She had made it clear that this wasn't just a marriage. It was a key to the survival of her people, and in some strange way, the fate of his world too. But as the ceremony preparations began, James began to realize just how serious this situation was. The palace was alive with activity. Exarchan servants rushed around, organizing everything for the wedding. Large banners were being hung from the walls, and intricate decorations of strange alien flowers were being arranged. The entire palace seemed to be buzzing with excitement, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. He was led into a grand hall, where a small group of Exarchan officials awaited him. They were silent, watching him closely, as though they were waiting for something. The pressure on James' chest seemed to grow with each passing moment. "James Carver," one of the officials said in a deep, formal voice, "the preparations for the union of our people are nearly complete. But before the ceremony begins, you must understand the significance of the rituals that will take place." James nodded, though he wasn't sure if he could truly understand what was about to happen. He had been told that the marriage would require him to undergo a series of strange ceremonies, rituals that were important to the Exarchan, but completely unfamiliar to him. The official motioned for him to follow, and James complied. They walked through a set of grand doors into a large chamber. It was filled with a soft, warm light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols that flickered gently. "This is the Chamber of Unity," the official explained. "Here, the union will be forged. You must take part in the binding ritual. It is a symbolic act that connects your soul to that of the Queen." James swallowed hard. His thoughts were already running wild. A binding ritual. He hadn't signed up for anything like this, but there was no turning back now. He was already a part of this strange world, whether he liked it or not. As they continued, James saw more strange sights. The Exarchan people moved with grace, their glowing blue skin shining in the light. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but there was a calmness about them that made him feel oddly at ease. Finally, they reached the center of the chamber. In the middle stood a pedestal, and atop it, a crystal orb that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The official explained that this was the source of the energy that would bind the two worlds together. "You must touch the orb, James Carver," the official said. "When you do, the power of the union will flow into you. It will not be painful, but it will be profound. Do you understand?" James took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "I understand," he replied, though his voice was uncertain. The official nodded and stepped back, leaving him standing alone in the center of the room. All eyes were on him. His mind flashed back to the first time he had been on the battlefield, facing the unknown. This was no different. This wasn't a fight he could win with weapons or force. It was a battle of choices, and the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced before. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch the orb. As soon as his fingers made contact, a wave of energy surged through him. It was like nothing he had ever felt. Warm, overwhelming, yet oddly comforting. The night before the ceremony, James Carver sat alone in his quarters, staring at the soft glow of the alien lights outside his window. The city below was quiet, the streets empty in preparation for the event that was to come. Tomorrow, everything would change. The decision he had been avoiding was now unavoidable. He would marry Queen Siralath, the ruler of the Exarchan, and the future of both their worlds would depend on it. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind still spinning with thoughts. Was this the right choice? He had been a soldier for most of his life, trained to fight, to follow orders, to protect. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. There were no clear lines of right and wrong, no enemies to fight. This was about trust, about connecting with another species in a way that he didn't fully understand. James had been trying to wrap his mind around everything. Siralath had told him about the curse that plagued her people, about the way this union could help them escape it. But what about him? What about his own future? If he married her, he would never be the same. He wouldn't be the same man who had boarded the ship months ago. He would be something else entirely, a symbol of peace between two worlds, a bridge that connected them forever. The problem was, he didn't feel ready. He didn't know Siralath well enough to make such a huge commitment. Their conversations had been polite, formal, even sometimes personal, but he hadn't felt that spark, that connection that people talked about when they spoke of love. He didn't know if it was even possible to love her, not in the way that marriage demanded. There was also the matter of his duty to his own people. If he rejected the marriage, the peace between Earth and the Exarchan could be at risk. The Exarchan were a powerful species, and their wrath could have devastating consequences. But if he accepted, he would be tied to them forever. He couldn't take that back. There would be no turning away from the choice he made tomorrow. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. For a brief moment, he let himself dream of home, of Earth. He missed the familiar faces of his comrades, the quiet nights in the barracks, the simple things. The life he had left behind felt so far away now, almost like a dream. But when he thought about the Exarchan people, about Siralath, he knew that the fate of both worlds rested in his hands. The weight of that knowledge was enough to make his shoulders sag with exhaustion. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned, surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Come in," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The door opened, and Siralath stepped inside, her presence as commanding as always. She was dressed in flowing robes, her face calm and serene, but there was something in her eyes, something that James couldn't place. She walked toward him without hesitation, her gaze never leaving his. "I thought you might need company tonight," she said softly. "It's a big decision, I know." James opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure what he felt anymore. "I'm scared," he finally admitted, his voice raw. "I'm scared of what happens if I say yes. I don't know if I can do this." Siralath paused, her eyes filled with understanding. She took a step closer to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not alone in this, James," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Whatever choice you make, you will not face it alone. I will stand with you, as your partner, as your equal." James looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw not just the queen but the woman beneath. The weight of the decision was still heavy, but in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't walking into the unknown alone. The night was still, the palace silent except for the soft hum of distant machinery. James Carver sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands, deep in thought. He had made the decision. Tomorrow, he would marry Sirlath. There was no turning back now. But even as the words echoed in his mind, a new feeling began to stir inside him, a feeling that he had made the right choice, despite all his doubts. Just as he was about to stand and prepare for bed, there was a soft knock on the door. He turned, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to come at this late hour. "Come in," he called. The door opened slowly, and Sirlath stepped inside. She looked different tonight. There was no crown on her head, no armor, just a simple robe that made her look even more human, more approachable. Her expression was serious, but there was a softness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. "You came," James said, standing up, his voice low. He hadn't been expecting her, but in a way, he was glad she was here. "I had to," Sirlath replied softly. "There are things you need to know, James. Things you might not fully understand about the decision you're making tomorrow." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Sirlath stepped closer, her gaze steady but filled with something deeper. "You're not just marrying me to form an alliance between our peoples," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more to this bond than you realize. It's not only my people's future at stake, but yours as well." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? I thought this was about peace between Earth and Exarchan. You said it would break the curse on your people." Sirlath nodded, but her eyes darkened. "It's true that our species have been cursed for generations, but what I didn't tell you before is that this curse is not just a physical ailment. It's a curse that binds us to a destiny we cannot escape. Only the union between us, between you, James, and me, can break this bond. But not just in a political sense. The bond between us must be something deeper. It must be real." James blinked, trying to process her words. "What are you saying? You want me to love you?" Sirlath's gaze softened. "Not just love. I need you to trust me, James. The curse can only be broken if the bond between us is formed through genuine connection. It's not enough for us to simply get married and hope for the best. We must unite our hearts, our minds, and our souls. This will not be easy." James stood still, his thoughts racing. "And if I don't? What happens if I can't form that connection?" Sirlath took a deep breath. "If the bond is not formed, if you do not truly accept me as your partner, then the curse will never be lifted. The Exarchan will fall into ruin, and Earth will be drawn into a war we cannot win." The weight of her words hit James like a hammer. This wasn't just about politics or duty. This wasn't a simple choice. He was being asked to give more than just his name. He was being asked to open his heart, to trust someone he barely knew. For the first time, James understood the true depth of what was at stake. This wasn't just about his future. It was about the survival of both their worlds. And the decision he made tomorrow would shape the course of history. "Are you asking me to love you?" he whispered, the question heavy in the air. Sirlath looked at him with a quiet intensity. "Yes, but not just love. I'm asking you to truly accept the bond we share. Only then will the curse be broken." James stood in silence, trying to understand the enormity of what he had just learned. The decision was no longer just a political move. It was a choice that would affect the very fabric of his life and the future of two worlds. The day of the wedding was finally here, and James Carver couldn't escape the feeling of unease that seemed to hang over him like a storm cloud. The palace was alive with activity, servants and officials rushing around, making final preparations. The air was thick with anticipation, but for James, everything felt heavy. The weight of the decision he had made settled on his shoulders, and no matter how many times he told himself he had no choice, doubt still lingered. He stood alone in his quarters, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He was dressed in formal attire, a suit designed for the ceremony, its sleek lines and metallic fabric reminding him that he wasn't on Earth anymore. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, either. Today, he was about to become the husband of an alien queen, and he had no idea what that would mean for his future. The door to his room opened without a knock, and Saralath entered. She looked beautiful, her robes shimmering in the soft light that filled the room. Her usual confidence was replaced by a quiet grace, and for the first time, James saw something else in her eyes. Uncertainty. "I didn't expect to see you before the ceremony," James said, his voice a little strained. Saralath gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I thought perhaps you might want some company. It is a big day after all." James chuckled softly, but the sound was empty. "I think I've had enough company for today." She nodded, walking toward him slowly. "James, I know this is difficult. I understand that you don't fully know what this will mean for you, for both of us. But I want you to know something." She stopped in front of him, her eyes locking with his. "I don't expect you to have all the answers. I don't expect you to love me right away. But I do need your trust." James met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a political alliance. It wasn't just about breaking a curse or saving two worlds. It was about their future together, whatever that meant. And right now, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't turn back. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can trust you the way you need me to." Saralath's expression softened. "Trust doesn't come all at once, James. It's built over time. But we don't have time. This is our moment. We have to make it count." James nodded, feeling the pressure of her words settle over him. His heart was still uncertain, but he couldn't deny the strength of the connection between them. It wasn't love yet, but there was something there, a pull, an unspoken understanding. And perhaps that was enough for now. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Saralath spoke again, her voice quiet. "Whatever happens today, remember this. You are not alone in this. I will stand by you, no matter what." James took a deep breath. "I don't know what the future holds, Saralath, but I know that we have to try. We have no choice." Saralath smiled softly, and for the first time since their meeting, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes with certainty, but the kind that comes from making a decision and trusting that, together, they could face whatever came next. "Then let's make it count," she said. James looked at her, his heart still racing, but now with a sense of purpose. Tomorrow, they would marry. Tomorrow, their worlds would change forever. And for better or worse, he knew that his life would never be the same again. The grand hall was alive with excitement. Xurkan officials, dignitaries, and guests from all across the galaxy filled the room, their chatter blending with the soft, melodic sounds of alien instruments. The air was thick with anticipation, but for James Carver, it all felt surreal. He stood at the front of the hall, dressed in ceremonial robes that felt like they belonged to someone else. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like an anchor, keeping him rooted to the spot. He glanced to his side where Saralath stood, her regal presence unmistakable. Her robes shimmered under the soft lights of the hall, her face serene and composed. But there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. Nervousness, perhaps. Or was it hope? James couldn't tell. He had been told that this marriage was important not only for their worlds but for their futures. But standing there, in front of all these people, the reality of what was happening hit him hard. The ceremony was about to begin. The Xurkan officiant stepped forward, his deep voice filling the hall. He was tall and imposing, his eyes glowing faintly with an eerie light. He spoke in the Xurkan language, his words flowing with a strange rhythm, almost like a chant. James couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. This was no ordinary wedding. This was a binding of worlds, a union that had the power to change the fate of two entire species. Sarah turned to face him, her expression softening. Without a word, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. The touch was warm, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through James. He could feel the weight of the moment in that touch. This wasn't just a formality. It wasn't just a political act. It was real. The officiant began to speak again, his words still foreign to James. The ceremony was progressing, but everything felt distant, almost dreamlike. It wasn't until the officiant motioned for them to step toward the center of the room that James fully realized what was happening. The binding ritual was about to begin. Sarah led him forward, and James followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The center of the room held a large glowing crystal, a symbol of the union between their peoples. As they stood before it, the officiant gestured for them to face each other. "Place your hands on the crystal," the officiant instructed, his voice reverberating through the hall. "Let your souls unite. Let your bond be formed." James hesitated for a moment, looking down at the crystal. The glowing light seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if it were waiting for them. Sarah's eyes met his, and in that moment, he knew there was no turning back. Slowly, he placed his hand on the crystal. Sarah did the same, and as their hands made contact with the glowing surface, a wave of energy surged through them. It was like nothing he had ever felt before, intense, warm, and overwhelming. For a brief moment, it was as though he could feel everything: the weight of their worlds, the history of her people, and the future of their union. The crowd was silent, watching in awe as the ceremony reached its peak. James' heart raced, but as he looked into Sarah's eyes, something shifted inside him. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him for so long seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet certainty. They were no longer just two individuals from different worlds. In this moment, they were united, bound by something stronger than politics, stronger than duty. Their bond was real. As the light from the crystal faded, the officiant's voice echoed through the hall. "The union is complete," he said, his voice filled with authority. "You are now partners, bound by fate, for the good of both your worlds." James turned to Sarah, and for the first time, he truly saw her, not just as a queen, but as someone who had become a part of his life, his future. And in that moment, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The ceremony was over. The hall was filled with soft applause as guests began to gather, their faces a mixture of admiration and curiosity. James Carver stood beside Sarah, still processing the rush of emotions that had surged through him during the binding ritual. The connection between them was real now, undeniable, and it was something that neither of them could ignore. As the last of the guests began to exit the hall, James and Sarah were left alone in the grand chamber. The glow of the crystal in the center of the room had faded, leaving only the soft light from the distant stars to illuminate the space. James glanced at Sarah, his heart still beating fast from the intensity of the ceremony. "I didn't expect it to feel so powerful," James said, his voice filled with awe. His hand still tingled from the touch of the crystal, and from Sarah's hand, which had rested beside his. It felt like their souls had truly merged in that moment, a connection beyond mere words or politics. Sarah turned to him, her face softened by the moment they had shared. "The binding ritual is not just symbolic. It is the heart of our union. Without it, our bond would never have been complete. But now we are one." James swallowed hard. He had never been a man of grand gestures or deep emotions. He had been trained to think logically, to focus on the task at hand. But standing here, in the presence of Sarah, he could feel something different stirring inside him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something he couldn't ignore. "I don't know what's next for us, Sarah," James admitted, his voice quiet. I don't know if I can love you the way you want me to. But I do know this. What we just did, what we've just shared, it means something. It's not just a political marriage. We've created something real." Saralath's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. "You don't have to love me right away, James. The bond between us is not just about love. It's about trust, partnership, and understanding. Love will come with time, but you must trust that we can build something meaningful." James nodded, but inside, there was a quiet fear that still lingered. He didn't know what love looked like for him. He had been taught to fight, to protect, but not to open his heart. The bond between them felt genuine, but could it grow into something deeper? Was it possible to fall in love with someone you barely knew, someone so different from you? "I'm afraid, Saralath," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm afraid that I won't be able to give you what you need." Saralath reached out, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You've already given me more than you realize, James. You've given me your trust, your partnership, and your willingness to try. That is more than I ever hoped for." James looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just a queen, not just an alien leader, but a woman who had placed her faith in him, in this union. And as he gazed into her eyes, something shifted inside him. Maybe love wasn't about perfect timing. Maybe it was about making the choice to try, to open up, and to trust. "I'm ready to try," James said, his voice steady. "We'll do this together, no matter what comes next." Saralath smiled softly, and for the first time, James felt a sense of peace. They didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, they were united, and that was enough. The days following the wedding felt like a blur to James Carver. The grand celebrations had ended, the guests had returned to their planets, and the palace had quieted down. But for James, everything had changed. The weight of the ceremony, the bond he had shared with Saralath, had shifted something deep within him. He had never imagined he would end up in a place like this, married to an alien queen, bound by a ritual that had tied not just his future, but the future of two worlds together. The decision he had feared so much was now behind him, and in its place was something new, an uncharted path. James walked through the palace gardens, his thoughts a mix of confusion and clarity. He couldn't deny that the bond they had formed was real, but the question remained, what did it mean for him? What did it mean for Earth? Saralath's people had been saved from their curse, but what about him? What did he want now that everything had changed? The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He turned to see Saralath approaching, her long robes trailing behind her. She had a serene look on her face, but there was something in her eyes, an unspoken question, perhaps. "James," she said softly, stopping in front of him. "How are you feeling?" James smiled slightly, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm still figuring that out." Saralath nodded, understanding. "I know this is not easy for you. It's not easy for me either. But what we've created is more than just a marriage. It's a partnership, a true bond, and we will face whatever comes next, together." James felt a warmth in his chest at her words. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much truth there was in them. They were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were a team, bound by something stronger than mere politics or duty. They had something real, something that could grow over time. "I didn't expect to feel like this," James said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't expect to feel connected to you." Saralath reached out, gently taking his hand in hers. "It's not love yet, James, but it's a beginning. And beginnings are powerful." James looked at their hands, the connection between them feeling solid, as though it were something unbreakable. He had been so afraid of what this marriage meant, so afraid of losing himself in something he couldn't control. But now, standing here with Saralath, he realized that he hadn't lost himself. He had found a new version of himself, one that was connected to a bigger purpose, a higher cause. "We'll take it one day at a time, won't we?" James said, his voice steady now. "Exactly," Sarilath agreed, her eyes sparkling with a mix of hope and determination. We'll build our future together, and no matter what challenges come our way, we will face them as partners, as equals. James nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. He had come so far since the first moment he had arrived on this planet, uncertain and confused. Now he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. They were no longer strangers, no longer distant allies. They were family, bound by their shared experiences and the trust they had built. Together, James repeated, the words feeling right. Sarilath smiled, her gaze softening. Yes, together. Always. As they stood there, in the quiet of the palace gardens, James knew that the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: whatever happened, they would face it together. And that was all he needed to know.